Hello. Listening is a relational practice that enables us to live in the world with others, but it is also a complex political and agonistic practice. While we focus on the speaker, we never listen in a void, but within a background that we have to map and understand. In the same way that we are situated speakers, we are also always already situated listeners. We always listen from somewhere, no matter how open or willing we are to move from our position. In this talk, I draw on my experiences of listening to migrant and refugee women's stories of displacement and explore questions around discourses and practices of listening across borders and languages. My talk emerges from a Leverhulme-funded research project revisiting the nomadic subject, in which I have explored the use of the nomadic subject in feminist theory and politics. The main research question that I have raised is whether nomadism has become a concept politically loaded and irreparably infected with the unbearable heaviness of those who are not able to move and cross borders and boundaries, the dark side of the moon of privileged mobility. Since this was a narrative research project, I only asked my participants one question in the beginning. Please tell me the story of how you traveled to Greece. You can start wherever you want and you can end wherever you want. I'm not going to interrupt you. At the end of their story, I asked them a second question about how they imagine their lives in 5 to 10 years' time. This was a way of opening up their stories to some sort of radical futurity, an urge for movement thinking, which, according to Michel Azier, and I quote here, helps people imagine the possibility of going forward in a completely hostile context. End of quote. Out of the 22 narrative interviews, which were all recorded with the consent of the participants, 6 were conducted in Farsi, 5 in English, 4 in Arabic, 3 in French, 2 in Greek, and 2 in Pashto. The Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto interviews, 12 in total, were conducted with the presence of an interpreter. The research was conducted in Athens and in Lesbos, Greece, between 2018 and 2019. My participants were recruited through a number of international civic and feminist organizations working with migrant and refugee women in Greece. My situated position as a white academic feminist was entangled with the radical activism of my youth in Greece when I was still a university student. Those years have forged lifelong friendships with women who are now in the forefront of a wide range of non-governmental and civic organizations for women's rights in Greece. It was mainly through these networks that I was introduced to the women who shared with me their stories of forced displacement. Most of the women who participated in this research told me that they did it because they wanted their voices to be heard and their stories to be circulated more widely. My entry in the field was thus marked by trust and feminist solidarity, and therefore the feminist activism of my past created the conditions of possibility for this research. In situating my position in the context of this research, I follow, of course, what has now become the canon of positionality in feminist and narrative research. At the same time, however, I want to challenge this canon and point to its limitations and constraints. To put it simply, even if or when you acknowledge your situated position, is this enough to navigate the assemblage of power relations within which researchers find themselves inevitably entangled? In this light, the central question that I explore in this talk is how we communicate indifference. In doing so, I draw on Iris Marion Young's notion of asymmetrical reciprocity as a theoretical and political intervention in feminist critical discussions of Habermas' theory of communication through the lens of communicative ethics. Drawing on Hannah Arendt's and Adriana Cavarero's philosophical take on narratives, what I finally argue is that it is the power of relational narratives that connects us in the web of human relations on a plane that embraces rather than erases differences. Can the subaltern speak? Gayatri Spivak has provocatively asked in a question around which a lot of feminist ink has been spilled over the years. Even if the subaltern can speak, can the colonizer listen? Emma Jones has wondered, proposing ontological deafness as a component of Western listening practices within feminism and beyond. This is the point where I consider the politics of listening, drawing on Hannah Arendt's and Adriana Cavarero's take on political narratives. To the Arendtian line that human beings as unique existence live together and are constitutively exposed to each other through action and storytelling, Cavarero adds the narratability of the self, its constitution as a unity through the desire of listening to her story being narrated. Lives and stories meet in a matrix of power and desire, producing realities and saturating bodies. In this light, the self emerges through the I-you relationship that is enacted in the process of storytelling. And yet, the singular you has been marginalized in the cultural politics of our geographies and times, Cavallero has observed. The you, too, is a term that is not at home in modern and contemporary developments of ethics and politics. In recovering the importance of the singular you, narration is a process wherein the self emerges as relational, but also always opaque. But is opacity a problem? Edouard Glissant has extensively discussed the right to opacity, noting that the injunction of transparency in Western processes of understanding always involves a reductionism of complexities and multiplicities within the boundaries of conceptual norms. If we examine the process of understanding people and ideas from the perspective of Western thought, we discover that its basis is this requirement for transparency. In order to understand and thus accept you, I have to measure your solidity with the ideal scale, providing me with grounds to make comparisons and perhaps judgment. I have to reduce. Glissant's argument for the right to opacity highlights the importance of relations without understanding as a ground for freedom. In Glissant's analytics, then, opacity is an existential affirmation of difference against the imperative of sameness and mimesis. And I quote here, that which protects the diverse we call opacity. End of quote. While declaring and indeed demanding the right to opacity, Glissant nevertheless weaves this need into his poetics of relation. Thinking about listening in Arendian terms, Susan Bickford thus considers the way listening practices create exclusions and inclusions. As Gloria Anzaldúa has poetically put it, even when we do speak from the cracked spaces, it is con voz del fondo del abismo, a voice drowned out by white noise, distance, and the distancing by others who don't want to hear. What Bickford suggests is that the way we are heard or not by others charts our presence or absence in the political arena. Audibility then goes hand in hand with vocality in what Young configures as deep democracy, practices striving for inclusion within assemblages of social, political, economic, and cultural differences. Bronwyn Davies has further developed the notion of emergent listening as distinctive from listening as usual. If our listening is driven by what we already think we know, then we cannot immerse in a multisensual encounter with the world, a process that can reveal more than and at times against what we know. Emergent listening is a becoming, unfolding in the middle of stories, in the intermezzo of narratives, and foregrounds the possibility of affective openness to the other. In this context, migrant and refugee women's stories of traveling were at the heart of how I have made connections with their experiences of forced displacement. My encounter with them was an instance of what Young has highlighted as the concrete encounter with others, an event which created conditions of possibility for situated knowledges and understandings to arise. Attentive and effective listening has facilitated such concrete encounters, although it did not necessarily involve or generate empathy, neither did it always end up in agreement or in a harmony of viewpoints. Following Young, I'm against erasing differences and the effects they make. And yet, the acknowledgement of difference does not preclude the possibility of recognizing the needs, desires, and perspectives of differently situated subjects. On the contrary, listening to the expression of the needs and desires of others is a precondition of being listened to in the dialogics of what Young has configured as communicative ethics within the context of asymmetrical reciprocity. The idea that we can understand others' experiences by imagining ourselves in their place is understandable as an everyday moral discourse, but becomes deeply problematic if turned into a moral theory, Young has argued. Her suggestion is the possibility of asymmetrical reciprocity, a plane on which subjects acknowledge and take account of the other without necessarily assuming their perspective. In offering the notion of symmetrical reciprocity, Young has criticized Saila Benhabib's notion of symmetrical reciprocity, a view that by taking the perspective of the other through imagining ourselves in their position, we constitute a realm of moral respect in our relationship to others. Drawing on Hannah Arendt's Kantian notion of the enlarged thought, the idea that people can move from a merely subjective understanding to an objective moral judgment, Benhabib has argued that although we are all differently situated subjects, it is possible to reverse perspectives among members of a moral community. This is a quote, and judge them from the point of view of the others, further adding that such reversibility is essential to the ties of reciprocity that bind communities together. This is a problematic assertion for Young, since each participant in a communication situation is distinguished by a particular history and social position that makes their relation asymmetrical. While taking the perspectives of others into account is important, imagining ourselves in their position is a different matter. Moreover, such a stance obscures differences and can also have unforeseen and undesirable political consequences. Young follows Benhabib in highlighting the importance of moral respect and egalitarian reciprocity. She suggests, however, that a communicative ethic should develop an account of the non substitutable relation of moral subjects by bringing Derrida's idea of the gift, Irigaray value of wonder in ethical relations, and Arendt's notion of enlarged thought in dialogic communication. And I read here from her essay. In this essay, I criticize the idea that moral respect entails being able to adopt the standpoint of others. Instead of an ideal of symmetrical reciprocity between moral subjects, I offer an ideal of asymmetrical reciprocity. Moral respect between people entails reciprocity between them in the sense that each acknowledges and takes account of the other. But their relation is asymmetrical in terms of the history it has and the social position they occupy. I offer the practice of giving gifts as an illustration of this asymmetry. From Lucy Irigaray, I take over the value of wonder in ethical relations, and I suggest that the theory of communicative action should give more attention to questions as a way of expressing moral respect. I argue that the assumption of asymmetrical reciprocity facilitates a better interpretation of Hannah Arendt's notion of enlarged thought than an interpretation that assumes the possibility and desirability of taking the standpoint of other people. For Derrida, there is a strong connection between language and the structure of the gift within an ethical relation, which is always asymmetrical. Since the gift is outside the exchange economy, the only way to respond to a gift offering is to accept it. Temporality is thus very important in Young's configuration of asymmetrical reciprocity, since gift giving initiates a series of offerings and acceptances as unique events in the structure of a communicative relationship. This ontological and temporal asymmetry in gift giving is thus transferred in the communicative action. We listen to a story, understand its meaning, and respond to it. But our response need not unfold within a symmetrical relation. I respond to your statement not by saying the same thing back to you, but by making another, different move in our language game. This asymmetrical response is also linked to Irigaray notion of wonder, the idea of being open to something new as constitutive element of the ethical relation. Taking Derrida's position of the relation between language and the gift, Irigaray's idea of the wonder, as well as the importance of narratives in the Arendian web of human relations, Young argues that we can understand the other not by reversing our moral standpoint, as Benabib proposes, but by being together, asking questions while being open to the unexpected, as well as listening attentively to stories which are taken as a gift of the self to the other. Marguerite Lacaze has pointed to the importance of asymmetrical reciprocity in theorizing relations between the self and other. She has also identified some problems in the way Young configures the concept in terms of wonder and the gift, problems that center on her neglect of the difference between wonder and respect, and her neglect of the significance of self respect. Wonder should go hand in hand with respect, Lacaze argues, since only insofar as we first recognize others as similar to ourselves through respect can we be open, without wonder becoming the kind of exoticism or awe that Young warns against. Wonder cannot encapsulate respect, Lacaze notes, and in a similar vein, respect is tightly linked to self respect, which is not something based on esteem for our character or achievements, but a more fundamental respect for our humanity or our own fundamental worth or dignity, to use a Kantian term. In further discussing Young's notion of communicative democracy, Francisco Hodzivan Hueves de Lima and Emil Albert Sobotka have highlighted her argument that cultural forms such as salutations, rhetoric, and storytelling become embodied, emotional, and spontaneous components of communicative ethics and contribute to political discussions and deliberations. Communicative democracy must expose particularities instead of universalisms, narratives instead of speeches, emotional components instead of abstract reason, bodily expressions instead of protocols and formalism, thus making pluralism and its diverse forms of evidence emerge so that people and groups previously silenced and obliterated can feel part of the democratic dynamics. In considering the materiality, spatiality, and embodiment of communication on the plane of asymmetrical reciprocity, I thus turn now to the Karatepe event, which erupted in the process of my fieldwork in Lesbos in April 2019 and was catalytic in the way I came to see and understand my relation to the women who accepted to participate in the research project by sharing their stories of forced displacement and traveling. When making contacts with civic organizations in Mytilene, Lesbos, in preparation for my fieldwork there, I got in touch with Caritas Hellas amongst other groups. After talking to the organizers about my research, they invited me to give a talk to a group of women who were participating in the program Transition, Cooperation, Empowerment, and Social Integration for Migrants and Refugees in Greece. Their idea was that once women had met me and listened to my talk, they could decide whether they wanted to participate. I highly appreciated this suggestion as it would give the refugee women of the camp an opportunity to have a first-hand experience of a research in a way that went well beyond the formalities of the informed consent and forms of signing in the protocol of the ethics procedure. At the same time, I was both excited and deeply problematized. Being aware of the huge debates among feminists around the discourses and practices of empowerment, I was wondering about how I could talk to these women, being true to them and to myself, in the light of Lacan's importance of self respect that we have discussed. In asymmetrically reciprocal relations, we should respond to others with humility, Young has argued, and it was in this affective realm that I was preparing for the event. Within the narrative sensibility of my research, I thus decided to share Nadia's story with the women of the Karatepe camp as a narrative of perseverance and hope. Nadia is a young Afghan woman who was separated from her mother and sister when she was 15 years old while trying to cross the Turkish-Greek borders. She worked at the Istanbul textile industry for 3 years under conditions of modern slavery before she was able to travel to Greece on her own. When I interviewed Nadia in Athens in the summer of 2018, she was working as a volunteer for refugee civic organizations. She was completing a scholarship course on English for academic purposes and was already successful in a follow up scholarship to study for a degree in tourism and hospitality. More importantly, she had found her mother and sister through the Red Cross track process, and she was waiting to reunite with them in Germany. At the time of the interview, Nadia had expressed a desire for her story to be shared with other refugee women as an Arendtian way of inserting herself in the web of human relations through narratives. My talk at the Karatepe refugee camp was arranged for April 9, 2019. Unlike the notorious Moria camp, which was a hot spot, a registration and identification center, Karatepe was a refugee camp run by an organization linked to the municipality of Lesbos. This medium-sized camp could only accept a restricted number of refugees, 800 at the time of my visit, usually those who were in particularly vulnerable conditions. Each family lived in a container while several civic organizations had their offices and facilities there, including a women's friendly space where my talk was hosted. I had already visited the Karate camp in March 2019 when I gave a seminar about the force of life histories to a group of service providers, including teachers, advisors, psychologists, and health carers, working in different state and civic organizations in Lesbos, so I was familiar with the premises and procedures. This time was different, however. It was a rainy afternoon, and I could see that the organizers were apprehensive and worried about women's participation. We don't expect many women, they told me straight away, and because of the rain, we expect even less. There were two groups of women when I entered the container, no more than 8 altogether, and 2 to 3 prams. Well, if we have 12 attendees, that would be excellent, the organizers told me. I mingled with the women, and with the help of the interpreter, I started chatting with them. There were some younger women who could also speak English, so we were laughing our mutual embarrassment away, or perhaps we were entangled in the respect, wonder assemblage that Lacaze has added in Young's notion of asymmetrical reciprocity, as already discussed above. As it was getting closer to 3 p.m. in the afternoon, more and more women started coming in the container. We were initially sitting in a kind of circle, but I had to stand up to give space for more chairs and prams to be accommodated. By 3:10, the container was literally packed and the door was open for a large group of women who were standing outside to be able to listen, as the rain had fortunately stopped. The desired number of 12 had blown up to 60 plus when I started narrating Nadia's story. As the story was unfolding, I could see it in the women's shining eyes that they were listening. As they were gradually drawn into the space time of the narrative, they were becoming part of its process and practice. They were nodding their heads, they were smiling, and when the talk was over, a young Afghan woman with a beautiful pink scarf stood up and said, "Let's clap for Nadia." When the applause was over, she stood up again and sang, "And now one for Maria." A story told is a story bound to circulate. Trin Minha has beautifully written. I was terribly moved by this warm response, and after surpassing my initial fascination, wondering, and puzzlement, I encouraged these women to ask questions, and they did. There were all sorts of questions, mostly about getting access to educational opportunities, but also more personal ones around my project. They wanted to know about my website and about my research more generally. Some of these women were very well educated. There were lawyers and doctors and nurses and teachers amongst them. There were several young mothers and some older women as well. The label refugee women was erasing the differences amongst them, but also annihilated the unrepeatable uniqueness of their existence in the web of human relations. As I have already said, questions are very important in Young's configuration of communicative ethics. Young has critically observed that the role of questions as bonds of solidarity is downplayed in Habermas' theory of communicative action, but become crucial when communication is considered within the structure of asymmetrical reciprocity. By contrast, the theory of communicative action that gave more attention to the asymmetry of speakers, to the ways in which there are always excesses and resistances, despite overlaps in the speaker's interests and understandings, would attend more to questions as uniquely important communicative acts. Questions can express a distinctive form of respect for the other, that of showing an interest in their expression and acknowledging that the questioner does not know what the issue looks like for them. Refugee women's questions opened up a dialogic scene where ideas were exchanged, problems were raised, and issues were discussed, not only between the researcher as narrator, the protagonist of the story, and the participants as listeners, but also among the participants as both listeners, narrators, and protagonists of their own stories that were evoked and remembered within the narrative scene that is always relational. For Caballero, stories invoke a familiar feeling, sapore, through which we sense our unrepeatable uniqueness within the plurality of human relations. In this light, and while we were still all within the structure of asymmetrical relations, we did not need to imagine ourselves in each other's position to be able to understand and communicate. It was rather the Irigaray moment of wonder, of openness to the newness and mystery of the other person, that was opening up vistas to see, understand, appreciate, and respect the other through the gift of Nadia's story that kept circulating amongst us. Within the affective ambience of the event, which was very rare according to the organizers' comments, I was advised to ask the participants whether they wanted to take a group photo for the Caritas archives, which they accepted. But beyond the formal group photo of the event, there were many women gathering around me taking selfies. What was mostly moving at these moments of group selfies was the touching. They would touch my shoulders and hold mine and each other's hands in an embodied cadence. Drawing on Hortense Spiller's account of the flesh, Tim Husar has suggested that touching can become a modality of knowing beyond representation, an apprehension that brings together the body and the flesh in an entanglement of opening and closing, vulnerability and care. The moment of touching was indeed one of the most forceful moments in my experience as a feminist activist, and I will never forget it. It was an actualization of the embodied dynamics of communicative ethics. Chandras Mohanty's influential essay, Under Western Eyes, drew attention to the role of Western feminist scholarship in reproducing exclusive hierarchies of knowledge and has initiated a rich body of literature in decolonial feminist studies. In a close reading of Mohanty's Feminism Without Borders, influential book, Gail Polhouse has suggested the ideal of knowing without borders through the decolonizing process of epistemic gathering. Instead of simply challenging the subject of knowledge through the questions of who knows and whose knowledge counts, Polhouse has suggested that we should rather ask, with whom am I knowing and with what effect? Following Paul Howe's suggestion that knowing is not something that we do on our own, I have focused on the importance of listening to stories as a way of learning and understanding with others. Narratives have the power to involve us in the dynamics of thinking differently, and as Ruth Salvaggio has pointed out, feminist theories have used stories to unsettle theoretical abstractions and move into a place where truth and narrative intermingle in the endless telling of stories. The refugee women that I met at the women's friendly container of the Karatepe refugee camp had marked their own situated position. When they decided to come to the talk, they brought their own experiences, educational and cultural backgrounds, interests, and dreams. They decided to listen, and what they made of Nadia's story was different for each of them. In this context, there were two women in the Karatepe group who, after listening to Nadia's story, offered to share their own as a reciprocal narrative act. Their desire to tell their story erupted from affective listening to another woman's story in Cavarero's intertwined IU scene of relational narratives. This irreflexive move of telling one story is one of patterns of difference, politics of difference that I have tried to sketch in this talk. As String has poetically put it, women's stories have circulated like a gift, an empty gift which anybody can lay claim to by filling it to taste, you can never truly possess. A gift built on multiplicity, one that stays inexhaustible within its own limits, its departures and arrivals, its quietness. In receiving the pure gift of migrant and refugee women's stories, what I have argued in this talk is that narratives could become a trope that can enact non reciprocal relations of togetherness and understanding within Young's realm of communicative ethics. Thank you.